The contracts question from February of 2009 is all about real property, but there isn't a single crossover issue from that topic. Have a look at the call of the question. What arguments can developer make, and what is the likely outcome on each of the following points? 1. Developer did not breach the contract with builder. 2. Developer's performance was excused. 3. In any event, builder did not suffer $700,000 in damages. Well, looking at this call of the question, it seems that calls number 2 and 3 are likely to be pretty straightforward and fairly short, but the first call of the question could well call on us to do a fairly thorough contracts analysis. There's no ambiguity about what subject matter is being tested here. We've already got a basic idea in our head about the pattern of a contracts analysis. We are most likely to use that framework to answer question 1. Let's go to the top of the fact pattern and have a look at what happened. In paragraph 1, we meet developer, presumably our defendant in this question. Developers got an option to purchase this parcel called the Highlands from the owner. Notice owner isn't mentioned at all on the call of the question. Developer wants to build a residential development on the Highlands. Developer couldn't proceed until the city approved an extension of utilities to the parcel, and city had a well-known and long-standing policy of reimbursing developers for the cost of installing utilities, and that's an important background fact. Move on to paragraph 2. Now we learn about the contract that's the subject of this litigation. Developer signs a contract with builder for the construction of 10 single-family homes on the Highlands parcel. And then we get a look at section 14D of this contract. All obligations under this agreement are conditioned on approval by city of all necessary utility extensions. That's a key quote. But notice, during pre-contract negotiations, developer specifically informed builder that he couldn't proceed with the project unless city followed its usual policy of reimbursing the developer, and notice further, builder acknowledged that he understood such a condition to be implicit in section 14D, even though it is not explicit. And then notice, at the very end of paragraph 2, there's an integration clause. Next, turn to paragraph 3, and notice that city approves all of the necessary utility extensions to the parcel, in other words, meeting the plain meaning of the language of section 14D, but not living up to the implicit meaning of that section. So, developer abandons plans for the development, and he doesn't exercise his option to purchase the Highlands parcel from owner. Then in the last paragraph, we learn about builder's breach of contract action against developer for the $700,000 profit he would have made on the project. That's referred to in call of the question number 3. In the meantime, architect purchased Highlands from the owner and has contracted with builder to construct a business park there. And builder's expected profit on this new contract with architect is $500,000. And then we get the 3-part call of the question again. Well, it's a pretty interesting question if you take a moment and step back and have a look at it. It's also not a very complicated question compared to many other questions in this contract seminar. This is hardly the most brutal of our work together. So turn the page and have a look at how I've chosen to outline my answer to this question. And you'll see I'm not really doing anything out of the ordinary here. In order to answer the first question, what arguments can developer make that he didn't breach a contract with builder? Well, first we have to consider offer acceptance and consideration, but we don't have to consider them at great length because they're basically a given. The real action with regard to establishing the breach depends on our interpretation of section 14D. And you'll notice here I'm not doing anything very innovative either. But what I am doing is thorough. First, I start off by discussing the plain language of section 14D. Then I consider the parole evidence rule. And then I lead with a key fact, which is that the builder has acknowledged that this reimbursement provision was implicit, even though it isn't explicit. And as a direct result of that acknowledgement, we're able to conclude confidently that developer did not breach the contract with builder. But we're not done. We have to consider the second and third calls of the question. But notice, as we were able to intuit just by looking at the cause of the question, these two are fairly narrow. With regard to question 2, developers' argument that developers' performance was excused, well, that requires us to look into the frustration of purpose and commercial impracticability analysis, and it looks like a winner for the defendant. I conclude that developers' performance, in fact, is excused. Then, turning to the third call of the question, developers' argument that builder didn't suffer $700,000 in damages, well, here I just focus on the key fact, which is that the builder is going to help architect develop this parcel anyway and is going to profit $500,000. So without getting into any more subtleties, we're able to conclude for sure that builder did not suffer $700,000 in damages. So, as I say, we've got a pretty straightforward question here. It isn't entirely uncomplicated, but compared to many other contracts questions, this is fairly easy stuff. But we've really got to get into the factual details. Have a look at the answer that I've provided for this question, and you'll see right up front I lead with the facts, and I explain the context that this dispute arises out of. I explain that developer has chosen not to exercise his option to purchase the Highlands parcel, and that builder has sued developer for breach of contract, seeking the profit that he would have made on the project. And then I explain that developer has a number of different defenses to liability, the first and strongest of which is that he didn't breach the contract in the first place. Then I get into formation. I spend about 3 sentences, maybe 4 sentences on that, and then I turn to Section 14D. And you'll notice I spend more than half of page 1 and the first quarter of page 2 considering this issue. But notice, this isn't hard stuff. We were able basically to get this straight when we were reading the fact pattern. What requires us to really do a little bit of real work is organizing our answer carefully and then analyzing the facts thoroughly. Here, the developer is not disputing that he is subject to a valid contract. What he's arguing is that he never breached it, and based on our interpretation of Section 14D, we agree with him. But first we have to consider the language of Section 14D, and we have to make it clear that we appreciate the fact that what City has done has been enough to satisfy this plain language. And we also need to interpret the parole evidence rule, which typically would keep any of this extrinsic information away from interpreting this agreement. But we know that builder has acknowledged that the reimbursement provision was implicit in Section 14D, and that's a big problem for the builder because the result of this acknowledgement is that the developer is likely to win. The real argument between developer and builder, the real agreement, was contingent both on City approving the extension of utilities and on City agreeing to reimburse the developer. And because City changed its policy and decided not to offer the reimbursement to developer, the condition in Section 14D wasn't satisfied. And as a result, I conclude that developer didn't breach the contract with builder. Next, we turn to developer's argument that developer's performance was excused. So first we have to sort of assume that our answer to the first call of the question is wrong, and that Section 14D in fact ends up being interpreted against the developer. Well, at that point he can argue that his performance was excused. First he's argued that he's not in breach. But if he ends up losing that argument, next he can argue that his performance should be excused, not based on impossibility, but based on frustration of purpose and commercial impracticability. And here, I go into the facts in a fair amount of depth, but it only takes me 3 short paragraphs. And then I conclude that the developer is likely to prevail. I say that his performance, in fact, was excused, based on frustration of purpose and commercial impracticability. And that leaves us with only one final call of the question to respond to. Developer's argument that builder didn't suffer $700,000 in damages. Now, up front, rather than leading with the facts, I update reader about the status of our analysis. I've already concluded that developer is going to escape liability under this contract. Still, even if developer is found liable, builder is not going to be able to convince anybody that he suffered $700,000 in damages. And I focus on the key fact, that developer can use to prove this point, which is that builder is going to help architect develop this same parcel and profit $500,000 in doing so. And notice that I focus on exactly what happened. I lead off with the fact that builder is going to get to develop this parcel after all, with the actual buyer of the parcel, architect. And I notice also, and I explain, that plaintiffs have to mitigate their damages. And here, even if we assume the developer is not liable for breach of contract, or is liable, builder is going to make $500,000, and that would be deducted from any possible liability of developer. So the most that developer could be on the hook for here is $200,000. So it's easy to conclude that builder didn't suffer $700,000 in damages. And that wraps up the consideration of a very straightforward and a fairly easy common law contracts question.